Hello and welcome to this month's painting tutorial. This month we're going to tackle a little girl walking into a creek. It has some really extreme contrasts in landscapes and some very dull colors that I want to punch up a little bit. So the first step is to draw the composition on your watercolor paper. I've done most of that off camera to save time. I'm just using a normal HB pencil and I'm sketching not only the line of the figure but then also the vague sense of where these large shadow shapes go. Then of course these large vertical tree branches and tree trunks will also help to determine where I am in the picture plane. Then after you have sketched the drawing out, use a super nib fine line masking pen and protect some of those lines and shapes. Anything that's a highlight or a light color against a dark background, I'm going to protect. If you want to splatter in some dots, just make a puddle of masking fluid like this, then get a toothbrush, dip the toothbrush, and then shake it right on the painting like this. Alright, the masking fluid is dry now, so let's get painting. In this first step, I want to get a lot of color on the page with a minimum of interference from me, but a lot of flowing colors working together on the page. So I'm going to put down some paper underneath just to protect the work surface. And then I have some dishes mixed up with my colors all ready to go. So I have a dark green and a light green and a highlight yellow color. So I'm going to keep my reference material close as I paint. I'm focusing on getting these large shadow shapes and colors in. The highlights are already protected, but I still want to preserve the general feel of the light colors and the dark. I'm going to start with a blunt tip syringe, fill it up with that dark green, and just get a lot of the color on the page right in here where I see it on my reference material. And also up in this corner. 2 or 3 colors is better than 1. So I'm putting on that highlight green as well. Then I'm going to use a spritz bottle, spray them down a little bit, let those colors move, and then I'm going to use a brush handle and just kind of scratch them across the surface. So I'm guiding the colors, but I'm not painting with a brush. I don't want any brush feeling at this point. You can also blow, you can tilt the board, and since I have that paper underneath, I can just let it flow right onto the sheet. I've got a Prussian blue on a little brush here, just using this kind of the way I was using the brush handle to move the color around. And I want to make sure that the darks get all the way up to the edge of the figure so that I get the most out of my masking fluid. Then I'll get some Prussian blue sucked up into my syringe, and I'll do some of that same work focusing on more darks. And then just shift your paper back and forth like this. Now if I want to punch it back into this and blot up some of this dark, I can do that easily. Then I'll just fill in my syringe with a light green and hold the paper nice and flat so that it doesn't run too much. And then with my brush, before it has a chance to dry, I'm going to go into this bush shape and just help define it a little bit. That is looking spectacular. The last thing I might just do right here is run a little bit of the watercolor, that is to say the color of the water, under here, because it's going to mix together really easily while this color is fresh, and I'm never going to get that chance again. So I'm just going to lay in a little bit of the shadow color on the water, the edge of a flat brush like this. Let those colors mix together, and this is going to make the transition from dark shadow to highlights on the water a lot more easy. Add a few more darks here and there, especially where the weeds are casting shadows on the water. But I have some shadow shapes on the water up here. I'm just going to make them a little bit more red. On this left hand side it starts getting really light, so I'm just using that same color on my brush but washing the brush out first. So that's a good first coat, and I'm going to leave it there, come back to it when this is all dry. Now that first coat is dry, there's the bottom, here's the top, and here's the reference material again. So what we really need to do first while the masking fluid is still in place is to emphasize these darks back here. So this is going to be another fairly sloppy step, and so I'm keeping my protection in place. And then to protect these large white areas, I'm going to tear a shield. Just tear it to close to this right shape, like this. Then I'll get a large round, get that wet, and then load it up with some juicy dark color. And then I'm going to spritz the areas where I want that color to primarily go. Then just sprinkle, sprinkle, sprinkle like this. And I have a lot of control here, but I'm not hand making these dots so it doesn't look too constructed. Just take your time, it's not a race. Then remove your shields just to see the overall effect. And if you like it, then you can let that dry again. Now that background texture is dried, so let's push it forward. While the masking fluid is still in place, I want to do some work on these foreground light shapes. So I'm going to open up my little jar of the light green, and then I'm just going to spritz again, then use a large flat on the side and slice in some of that light green here and there. So I'm just trying to imagine what it's going to look like once I take the masking fluid off. And here's a yellow ochre for some of these accent areas. So just take note of the reference material and try to paint what you see here. I don't want to paint over everything. I've protected a lot of these individual grass stems, but when I take the masking fluid off, I don't want to find out that it's all gotten too dark, because it's going to be really hard to relighten it again. Then let's go up into the tree. I'll just add these tree trunks. This one side of the tree is actually a little bit brighter, so I'll get that wet and then I'll blot with my tissue here, and then just emphasize the opposite side, and I'll drop in the shapes for the trees back here as well. Then I can use the flat brush to just add some of these thinner branches too, and just give the impression of some trees growing back here. Alright, that's looking great. Let's put some more detail in this side. And this is really light struck, so I just have a really toned down green, put right in the center like this. And here I'm going to soften this edge, kind of soften that and then scrub it a little bit. Then also in this step I'm going to add that shadow shape over the water again. So let me come down here, and I'm squinting and trying to paint this in as one large shadow piece over the rocks and everything. I also see the same brown up here. If they get too dark, have a paper towel on hand so that you can just blot them light again. And that might be all I want. I'll let this dry, and then we're going to take off all that masking fluid. Now once everything's dry, get your rubber cement eraser and get all that masking fluid off the surface. The first thing I like to do after I've removed the masking fluid is to get a little scrubber, or you can just use an angled flat. Get that damp, and then I'm just going to soften up some of these bright whites. Just go rub, 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 and then blot it. Blot. So this takes a little while in itself because I've got a lot of dots to soften. So let me do this off camera and then I'll come back to you. Got it softened up now. I'm going to add some color to my highlights and tone them back a little bit. Just get a flat wet and then just paint some of those leaves. Not all of them, but here and there I'm going to add just a little bit of the light green. So you just kind of paint some and leave others white. Do that same thing down here and add some green to some of these grasses. Then let's add some more detail in the rocks. For that, I'm going to get a nice round that comes to a sharp point, and I'm going to work in the shadow shapes on these rocks. If there are prominent shadow shapes, add those first, and that will help you to find your way as you add the rest of the details. And I'm adding some shadow shapes to these rocks down here in the foreground too. But remember, always err on the side of less detail, because you don't want to make your paintings look overworked. Just give enough that the eye sees the rocks, and it will fill in more rocks than what you actually paint. The eye always bumps up a level of detail. Then I need to add some detail to my figure here. I'm going to work with my round again and start with the flesh tone, avoiding those sharp highlights, and paint in as large a pieces as you can. You want those strong, large shapes of colors to come through. So start with those, and then you can darken and add shadow shapes on top of the colors after this first layer is dry. And then she's wearing these pink shorts. Add the base tone of those and look for the shadow shapes again. And she has a white tank top. So I can paint it in a big piece like this. And don't go quite to the edge so that it looks like the light is coming from behind and sort of going around the outside of her form. I'm also going to use that same round and darken up the tree branches in the background one more time. Just straightening up those outside edges where I used masking fluid. I'm going to also sharpen up some of the leaf shapes in the background. I'm working on the negative shapes around the leaf, so I'm just concentrating on this interesting pattern here and strengthening up a little bit of it to give a stronger impression of leaves caught in bright sunlight. And for this sort of work, when you're just doing the same sort of thing in a large space, but you're going to be using the same color over and over again, get a little pot of paint right close, and then you can work faster. So let me put in some time in this background, and I'll come back and we'll do the finishing details. Now you see how adding some details, putting some time in, really helps to clean it up, and I'll show you how to finish up the rest. See, over the top of the dry first coat, I added a shadow layer, and now I'm just going to use a damp brush and I'm going to blend some of those colors a little bit more. And then the real trick is to have a few edges that are really distinct. So get a nice dark and then just go back carefully with a small round and really clean up the edges of her hair or some strong areas of contrast. It's really interesting how just a few lines like that will really make the figure pop and add so much to the realism. Here I'll carve out a wrist shape a little bit better, just using the background color. So that's looking a lot better. Now, if you have a few areas where you need small brights and they got washed over, you can use either white paint or, better yet, you can use aqua cover, which is liquid watercolor paper. Let's see that I just wanted to add a little bit of highlight on the outside of her arm here. Down here I'll just add a little bit more detail in the water and a dark wash over the top of these rocks. That contrast up front is going to help to give the painting depth. To finish it up, I'll just do a little bit more of this work like this, where I'm slicing out some finer lines in the weeds here by going in with a background dark. There, even that much makes it a lot better. So, let's call that good. That concludes this month's painting tutorial. I hope you've learned some things about keeping a high energy piece with a lot of movement and then also tightening in areas that you need it to be tighter. I'll upload the reference material so you can try your hand on it, and I think it's a lot of fun to paint this particular piece multiple times. I've done this one 5 or 6 times myself. So take it to your own studio, learn what you can about preserving the details and keeping it lively, and I'm sure that you'll take away a lot of lessons that you can use in other pieces in your studio. So thanks so much for watching, and I hope you join us again next month for another painting and drawing tutorial.